Welcome to Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. Coming up on the programme this week.
It's perfectly normal to have thoughts about ending your life. If you're in a crisis situation like that, or you're in a desperate situation, you've lost your job, etc., it's perfectly normal to have thoughts. 40% of the population have thoughts of suicide. 20% have serious thoughts of suicide.
To me, that maybe feels like there's the difference there, that you've got the group who know all this, but then the ability for that group to inform those within power to make the changes that group know would make a huge difference.
It's important for us to say these are the causes of death. Suicide is a means of death, not a cause, because these are all the causes of death. Because if you don't identify and understand the causes, you can't deal with the problem. You can't get the numbers down.
And I'll be reminding you how you can make connections with mental health organisations within your community. It's Mental Health Monday. The home of the UK's conversation about mental health. Welcome to Mental Health Monday. My name's Mick, and it's brilliant to have you with us once again. This podcast is coming out for World Suicide Prevention Day 2024. It's one day in the year. Let's make sure that conversation continues beyond there as well. So whenever you're listening to this podcast, thank you for checking out Mental Health Monday. There's some great work going on, by the way, around World Suicide Prevention Day. Just wanted to mention the team at CALM, the Campaign Against Living Miserably, are doing an amazing installation at Westfield. I'll put a link in the podcast notes to that. What they're doing is they're marking missed birthdays. The missed birthdays of young people lost to suicide. And they've put up birthday balloons in Westfield Shopping Centre in central London, representing young people from right across the country who've died by suicide. And each birthday balloon marks the age that they would have been had they not lost their lives. Of course, it's one of those things which when you look at it, you go, wow, what's this all about? And then you hear about the meaning. And hopefully at that moment, the impact strikes and people think, goodness me, yeah, we need to do something about that. And speaking of we need to do something about that, the suicide figures for England and Wales have been released for 2024, although they are the 2023 registrations. Suicides take a long time to be registered, so the figures are the most up-to-date figures, if you like, but they're officially the 2023 suicide figures. And it doesn't make great news, and I'm sorry to say this because there is so much fantastic work going on to prevent suicide and suicide awareness, in general mental health awareness, and yet the figures are at their highest rate since 1999. 6,069 lives lost to suicide registered in 2023 in England and Wales alone. The highest female rate of suicide since 1994. The highest rate overall since 1999, with the northwest, the northeast of England, and then Wales, the areas that are worst affected with the highest rates as well. Men and women, most likely to die between the ages of 45 and 64. That's always that shocking statistic. And yet there are other stats within it which show that numbers are rising in different age groups as well. That's always so concerning. And as we'll hear in this conversation, we shouldn't prioritize one particular group. We should try and look at the whole picture all the time, that these are not just numbers. These are people, these are lives lost, but also these are bereaved families. These are mums and dads, sisters, brothers who have to go on with life, having experienced this terrible, terrible trauma of losing a loved one to suicide. It's a really difficult conversation. It's one we've got to continue having, and it's one we'll have this week on the podcast with Paul Vittles. Paul's doing some fantastic work. He's just completed the Join the Dots tour across the north of England talking about suicide prevention, and his work in the Towards Zero Suicide community. The Zero Suicide Society Transformation Programme is a big part of his work as well. What are those steps that we can take to bring suicides down towards zero? Because for those people working within this community and for those who are working so hard to make change, to get things done, those figures, those 6,069 lives lost in England and Wales in 2023, make for very, very sobering reading.
Yeah, and it's very tough for people working in suicide prevention that are doing absolutely everything they can possibly do and taking what they know are the practical actions that get the numbers down, and then look at the numbers and they're not coming down. For people who've lived through suicide attempts, for people who've lost loved ones to suicide, this is really, really hard to see that the problem is not getting tackled. And it's tough for me as somebody who lived experience of suicide, somebody who works in suicide prevention, and somebody who works in transformational change. That's been my career for 35 years, So this is one of two problems that I think I've never been able to solve. The other one being climate change. And if you look at the numbers historically, they were coming down steadily through the 80s and 90s, despite recessions, because people are saying this increase is about the cost of living crisis. And so, well, we had recessions in the 80s, but the numbers kept coming down. In the 90s, again, we had recession at the beginning of the 90s, so there was a short-term uplift, and the numbers back on their long-term downward trend until 2007. And then it stopped, and it's flatlined for 15 years, and now it's going up. And so it's really, really tough. And we've got to look at the reasons why that graph flatlines and why the numbers are going up now, why we didn't keep it going on long-term downward trends. And the research that I've done and worked with other researchers and other people with lived experience of suicide, whenever we have our conversations about the practical actions and get the numbers down, we all know what the practical actions are, and we all believe we can get the numbers down, but the numbers are not coming down. So I use my professional experience as well as my personal lived experience to educate people about the reasons, the barriers to change, reasons why the numbers are not coming down, and what we need to do to get the numbers down.
I wonder whether or not, and this is my experience speaking to people within the community, if you like, is that in that particularly last 10 to 15 years, people who've experienced suicide have much more now in terms of things they can turn to, resources, support. I think that has increased, exponentially. What doesn't appear to be working in terms of a parallel with that is that the people who are not engaged with the suicide conversation becoming aware of some of the issues that other community are now massively aware of, are talking about, are campaigning about, are meeting about, are podcasting about, are doing everything about. And to me, that maybe feels like there's the difference there, that you've got the group who know all this, but then the ability for that group to inform those within power to make the changes that group know would make a huge difference.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the difficult things again about working suicide prevention is that a lot of people live in a bubble. They've had a horrific experience, lost loved ones. I mean, in my case, I've had my own personal suicide crisis, family crisis, lost lots of people to suicide. First suicide lost in 1980, we lost 15 blokes in our community to suicide. Then, most recently, we lost a family member in August 2020. I witnessed a suicide attempt on Monday. And this is a reality for me, and I've got to do everything that I possibly can to stop this happening. If somebody hasn't had that exposure, and bear in mind that 70% of the population have had some exposure to suicide, so it's a majority that have, it's just not a majority that talks about it. Most people quietly go away and try and pretend it didn't happen. But you've got that 30% of the population not exposed. And if that 30% not exposed to suicide in any way are MPs, ministers, heads of corporates, et cetera, then, it doesn't feature for them. If I go and talk to a business, a chairman, chief executive, leadership team, have had no exposure to suicide, generally they don't want to talk about it, fear talking about it, and it's not top of their list. And it's hard to get to talking about it. So generally you don't go trying to, knock down locked doors. As soon as somebody loses someone to suicide, I get a call from the chairman, the chief executive. We just lost somebody to suicide. We're devastated. Everybody in the business is completely devastated. It's not just the six. We must do something. That's the immediate change. Same with an MP or a minister. How many ministers do you hear even talking about suicide? It's extremely rare. Let's do something about that.
How much do you think, Paul, do we need to shift things in terms of people who have suicidal thoughts, and when they then look at their options and decide for their reasons that suicide is the best option open to them, that they feel at that particular moment, how do we arrest that? How do we turn that around? Because for me, that's that key moment, that there seems to be almost a sense of inevitability sometimes around suicide, that, someone's on a pathway which will lead into one particular direction. And I wonder whether or not, And I know people are in a very vulnerable state at that point, but there needs to be a shift in that thing of going, oh, I'm feeling suicidal, or I'm having these particular thoughts. There's a process now that I need to engage with in a way that if you had a lump on your testicle, you might be a bit embarrassed about going to your doctor, but you might think, this is the sort of thing I should go to. If you coughed up blood, if you did a countless other things, these things would naturally kick in because it's a learnt thing. Breast cancer is a great example. Blood in your poo is another example. How do we change that? What it's a publicity drive, I'm certain of it. But for me, that's such a key thing that if you had these feelings, straight away, it's not because you're weak or that because you're a loser in life or that people would be better off without you, that actually you're ill, that this isn't the sort of feeling that you should be having, that's healthy to be having, so therefore go and get some help. For me, that feels like a big shift to be able to encourage people to think in that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge education process. Most people know nothing, or little or nothing about suicide. They know very little about suicide prevention. They don't know anything about the suicidal mind. I go around, on the tour that we did across the hospital nursing, I did, about 40 educational talks, pulling up my banners in cinemas, rugby league grounds, the main shopping arcade in Wigan. I mean, just anywhere that would have us. And on the banners, we have the key messages. We have suicide can affect anyone, which is the absolute truth. Anyone can help prevent suicide. So the fact that that's true means that we need to get more people engaged in it. But also I had things on the banners there which caused incredible conversations, really deep, meaningful conversations with people. Like suicide is not just a mental health issue. So people go, well, what do you mean? I mean, surely somebody who kills himself must have a mental health issue. Yeah, what we're saying is that in most cases, when people take their lives, they don't have a long history of mental health issues. Some of them have no history of mental health at all. I mean, the high-profile case that was in the news this week, Ruth Perry, the head teacher, who killed herself after Ofsted turned up at her school and told her they were going to announce it in 90 days' time, that she'd be downgraded from outstanding to inadequate, and she wasn't told to anybody about it for 90 days. Well, 54 days into that death sentence, she killed herself. She spent 54 days imagining what was going to happen when the news came out that her school was inadequate. So, she had no history of mental health. So we need to educate people about all the reasons why people take their lives. The next line on my banner is, suicide is a means of death, not a cause of death. Now, that freaks people out. But the ONS put the statistics out saying, here's the latest cause of death statistics. And suicide is classified as a cause of death. Well, it's not a cause of death, it's a means of death. There's all sorts of causes. I was asked to go on the radio recently and the TV to talk about Graham's thought, taking his own life. Yeah, depression. I didn't say depression on his death certificate, cause of death, depression. It does cause of death, suicide. It's lumped in with everything else. But it wasn't, suicide was the means of death.
Why is it important to separate those two?
Well, because what happens is that people make assumptions, if they're not educated, make assumptions. And what they assume generally, if they're not educated, is that people become mentally ill and they have, bipolar disorder, or they have some kind of mental illness. And they have psychotic episodes and they can't control themselves for some reason and they kill themselves. Or they have mental illness and they're weak and they kill themselves, or they don't know what they're doing, they kill themselves. All these things that people assume to be the case. Now, that is the case in some cases, but then in other cases, what actually happens is people lose a job and have no hope of getting another job and they kill themselves. People have their relationship breaks down. They lose access to the kids. They get discriminated against by the family court. Dads get discriminated against by the family court all the time. They have a gambling addiction, subject to domestic abuse. We've got data now showing from Kent, which has now helped get a new issue into the national suicide prevention strategy. They found that more than a third of suicides in the area could be traced back to domestic abuse. And we, at our conference in June, we had Phyllis Daly, who lost her daughter Jessie to suicide, the first case in the country where a coroner ruled that domestic abuse that contributed to her suicide. We had on the tour Bob and Maggie Abrahart, who lost their daughter Natasha to suicide. And she was at Bristol University, and she had social anxiety disorder. And the university made her, as part of their course assessment, deliver a presentation to the whole class and all the teaching staff. And the day before she was due to do that, she took her own life. And that was the first case in the country of a university, the coroner saying a university contributed to the death of a student. Now, Bristol University at that point should have apologised profusely to the parents and unconditionally to the parents, and they should have gone away and done whatever they needed to do to stop other students taking their lives. But they didn't do that. They appealed the coroner's decision and took it to the High Court. It's important for us to say these are the causes of death. Suicide is a means of death, not a cause, because these are all the causes of death. Because if you don't identify and understand the causes, you can't deal with the problem. You can't get the numbers down. So, we just keep educating people constantly about all these issues. Gambling-related suicides have now made its way into the national strategy for the first time, and data is starting to come through. And just to explain to people why this happens, why we have this problem, the whole system is set up. It's biased and discriminatory, the whole system. So you'll hear academics, professors, lead advisors to government, civil servants, etc., saying, we need evidence-based policy. How many times do you hear that? We need evidence-based policy. We need data. Well, what happens is if somebody gets some data and puts it to the National Suicide Prevention Strategy Advisory Group, it's got a chance of getting in the national strategy and becoming a priority. If they haven't got the data, they can't get in. So if a group gets organised enough to get the right data and get it in front of the right people, they get more research, they get more attention, they get more money, they get classified as a priority in this kind of competition that's created, the winners and losers. If you haven't got that data, you don't get on the first base. Now imagine you're an unemployed person losing your job. You don't go down to local unemployed person's advocacy group and say, let's get some data together and let's try and get it in the National Suicide Prevention Strategy. You're desperately trying to feed the kids and get a job whilst you're being humiliated by DWP. That's your reality of life. So you are systemically discriminated against by the National Suicide Prevention Strategy.
So if we take all of that, is there an argument there that says that when a coroner makes a ruling of death by suicide, that actually there should be almost more information provided at that point as an official cause of death? So cause of death, gambling addiction, means of death, suicide, cause of death, systematic abuse, means of death, suicide. Would that be more helpful, do you think, in terms of then making organizations, governments, councils, whoever, respond in a way which says, actually, it's not just it was a suicide, so therefore it was a failure, it was a weakness, it was that person couldn't cope. It was actually, there was a specific cause of death, and that was something which we can take actions about, that we might even have strategies to take action on. And we can do that now, and we can start saving lives now.
Yeah, there's a few parts to that. First of all, you'll hear everybody working in suicide prevention saying we need more data. There's no doubt we need more data. But that isn't the answer. We've got loads of data that isn't being used well. So you shouldn't just say, give us more data. Everybody's swimming in seas of data. It's the right kind of data. Secondly, having on a death certificate, if you had death, suicide in brackets depression, or suicide in brackets domestic abuse, or something like that, that would be extremely useful data, because some of the people working in the field say, we still need to know that it's suicide. We still need to count up all the suicides. Well, of course, yeah. But you can still have suicide depression, suicide domestic abuse, suicide gambling, suicide online harm or something. It's just getting you more data to analyse to be able to do something more useful with. The National Confidential Inquiry, based at the University of Manchester, has records of suicides going back, many, many years, and do reports on the national database. And it's really useful stuff. It gives you some good pointers as to things we can do. But it's only limited by the data that can go into it. So if the data isn't collected, you can't analyze it, so you get a limited analysis that comes out. And the way that the academics tend to approach this is by saying these groups have a higher than average suicide rate, therefore we should be doing something about them. But that just compounds the problem, because everybody, again, it creates this competition where one group gets to be a priority and another group doesn't. So usually one group gets to be a priority and 15 don't get to be a priority. So I always say in my talks, we can't have competition in suicide prevention. Competition costs lives. Competition kills people. We have to have collaboration. Prioritization as well. Prioritization kills people as well.
Can I ask you about that? Because again, people will look at the figures and they'll see the highest rates of suicide in men and women are men between the ages of 45 and 64 and females between the ages of 45 and 64. And the lowest rates of suicide are young people between the ages of 10 and 24. But at the same time, increases in young deaths by suicide has been increasing now since it's still the lowest rate, but deaths have been increasing since 2012. There is a danger, isn't there, that if you put everything on trying to protect men over the age of 45, because you think, well, actually, young people are doing okay, you don't deal with what is actually happening, and the data shows it, that actually young deaths by suicide are increasing and have been increasing now for more than a decade. Eventually, you start solving one particular problem, and then you suddenly go, oh, but it turns out all these other numbers were... You've solved our problem. You've not solved the problem.
Yeah, it's what I call pushing the air around in the balloon, and that's what government does a lot of the time, and that's what a lot of people working suicide prevention do. There are thousands and thousands of suicide prevention charities and voluntary organisations, and community groups, and bereaved parents, and people who've lived through suicide attempts. Everybody's setting themselves up as activists and campaigns and advocates and so on. So it's very, very hard, because it is totally understandable on a human level that if you have lost a young person to suicide, you want something done about young people. If you've lost an older person to suicide, you want something done about older people. If you approach it from a statistical perspective, and so where are the biggest numbers? Middle-aged men. Let's do something about middle-aged men. It makes sense. And that kind of worked until 2007. That kind of approach worked because you kept chipping away at the priority groups in terms of higher than average suicide rates, and the numbers seem to be coming down, but it hasn't worked. That whole approach hasn't worked since 2007. The numbers are going up. So I've set up a Zero Suicide Society transformation program, and everybody who's involved in our program believes that the numbers should be on a downward trend towards zero, and we can get the numbers on a downward trend towards zero. Now, some people just immediately say, well, that's pie in the sky, you can't achieve that. But one of the things that you do to achieve that is you don't compete with each other. You take the competition out of the process, and governments and funding and the charities sector. So I would go to a young person's charity and say, right, so you're here to look after children, young people, and protect them from suicide? Yep, that's right. So do you do work with older people? Well, no, because we're a young person's charity. Okay. But young people have parents and grandparents, right? I mean, is the mental health of a young person affected by their relationship with their grandparents, or if they lose a grandparent, does that affect their mental health? Well, of course, yeah. I would go to Age UK and say, you look after older people. Or do you actually work with younger people? Well, no, because we're Age UK. Well, again, the mental health of an older person is affected by their relationship with their grandchildren a lot of the time. So one of the highest suicide rates over the past 20 years has actually been men aged 80 plus. It regularly spikes. It's a small sample relative to the rest of the sample, but it's regularly one of the highest suicide rates. Now, nobody looks at that because A, it's a small sample, and B, it's men aged 80 plus, and most people don't care very much about men aged 80 plus. That's the reality of it. And I'm a trustee with Age UK, so I have to deal with these issues all the time, right? But we had a neighbour recently, in that 80 plus category, who lost his lifelong partner. They've been together for 60 years. They've been married for 56 years. Now, people in that situation become suicidal, right? They have thoughts of suicide. But there's no machinery around them to cope with that because they're managed 80 plus. But if you actually wanted to do something about that, we know exactly what to do because we can put protections and support around somebody after they've lost a loved one Or the other spike is around older people who are physically very active and very outdoorsy and then become housebound. They immediately become high suicide risk. So you know exactly where to target and help. So yeah, it relates back to an earlier question you asked about the thoughts people have. It's perfectly normal to have thoughts about ending your life. If you're in a crisis situation like that, or you're in a desperate situation, or you just lost your lifelong partner or whatever, you've lost your job, etc., it's perfectly normal to have thoughts. 40% of the population have thoughts of suicide. 20% have serious thoughts of suicide. But you don't necessarily follow those through. And we can do lots and lots of things to stop people turning the thoughts into action. And even if somebody's got into a suicide crisis and they are actually trying to take their lives, there's lots of things that we can do to stop that happening, including restricting access to the means of suicide.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. I'll put links to the Towards Zero Suicide and the Zero Suicide Society Transformation Program in the podcast notes so people can find out more. When we hear about programs and we hear about strategies and so on and so forth, that's sort of like they have to exist in that format just because of the way that the world kind of works. Could you give us some examples, though, Paul, of, and you've kind of hinted at it there, I think, with that last answer, of those practical things, the things that we have seen that make a direct intervention that prevent suicide, or things further upstream which take people away from a pathway towards suicide, that these strategies, that these programs can deliver in real terms, if you like. Can you give us a couple of examples of in real life examples?
Sure. And just to frame that and finish off my answer to the previous question, I was talking about taking the competition out of this, right? So we advocate for a collaborative, cooperative approach. And one of our fundamental principles is that everyone must be a priority for someone. Now, that immediately challenges the system because they always go looking for priorities. I go to meetings with councils and government departments who say, often, and this is serious, at the moment, councils, at the beginning of a meeting, a multi-agency partnership meeting, they start the meeting by saying, right, we're here today to discuss this issue, and we just want to make it clear we've got no money. That's the first thing they say at the beginning of the meeting. So it starts with no money, and then there's a discussion about who's going to get a slice of the lack of money. That's the entire system, right? So what we do is say, no, everyone must be a priority for somebody. This is not about money. It's also not about money because preventable suicides costs the economy £10 billion a year, according to the report from the Samaritans and the London School of Economics, right? So it's costing us £10 billion a year. It's not a money issue, right? And we need to all do something about it. So then we say, right, everyone being a priority for someone means that the only priority group is anybody who isn't a priority for anybody else, right? If you're going to put a strategy together, just go looking for the people who are not a priority for anybody else. And if you've got a seat at the table of power, your first duty is the people who haven't got a seat at the table of power. That would turn the whole system on its head. Now, when you get into these practical actions, if you go, it's been shown by a study by Professor Jane Purkis from University of Melbourne, who's doing she's actually involved in a webinar on World Suicide Prevention Day next year, which anybody can attend via the Lancet. Jane did a meta-analysis around the world of what is most effective in preventing death, suicide death. And it showed that by far the most effective method is restricting access to the means of suicide. But it gets the least money. By far the least effective is general awareness raising campaigns, which have no impact on the suicide numbers, but often get lots of money, and people do a lot of it. So again, the system is upside down here. Now, restricting access is a whole bunch of very practical things. Like we launched our Join the Dots tour at the Humber Bridge, and we went to the Humber Wellbeing Hub, and they've run programs there in a very visible spot as people are coming into the park there, and they've started just opening the doors and running programs on depression and menopause and any issues anybody wants to talk about. Just come in and talk about it. As an alternative to not talking about it, right? And we know the consequences there. We had the national lead at our conference on frequently used locations. Darryl Gale, Director of Public Health from University of from East Sussex County Council, he talked about Beachy Head. Now, I just want to first of all say that we normally don't talk about means of suicide, and we are very strict about that in a lot of our work, and especially if you're communicating with vulnerable people, we shouldn't be talking about means of suicide. But for the purposes of this podcast, given the intention we're trying to help here, Darryl talked about Beachy Head. We've got 53 suicides today. And he talked about the distance between where the taxi drops people off and the edge of the cliff. That is an opportunity to save lives. At the Gap in Sydney, there's a guy who used to live there who saved hundreds and hundreds of lives during his life because he just went out and spoke to people. You can go around places around the world where they put out cloak bags for people to find. The Golden Gate Bridge got a net under the bridge this year, which is a fantastic success because it's the best way of stopping people killing themselves. And the community knew that. And they knew that 87 years ago, which is why they suggested it 87 years ago. And it's taken 87 years to get a net under the Golden Gate Bridge. Now, that's the challenge for us. It shouldn't take 87 years to have a practical solution being given and a practical solution implemented, right? So there's all that kind of stuff. And it gets more complicated when you get into the system. But again, you kind of identified this earlier, talking about coroners. What happens with coroners' reports, right? They don't go anywhere. They write a prevention of future deaths report, talking about the practical actions that can be taken to stop other suicides like the one that they've just investigated, and it sits on a shelf.
It's really interesting that, and I'm really struck by the idea of a suicide plus model for coroners. I feel like that is a sort of thing which, again, it could just be it's a slightly different way of working in the way that, Ofsted migrated school a slightly different way. But it would strike me that actually the data would change, but it would be useful data, and that when we're looking at figures, and we've not got time to come on to it today, but actually one of the issues around these figures, I was going to raise it, but we've probably not got time to discuss it, is like, for instance, that these are registrations of suicides in 2023. They're not necessarily suicides which took place in 2023, which means that we're still in this sea of not quite knowing, where rates are at and things like that. There's some real-time reporting around it, which reflects on a slightly different pace. But there's so much more to this conversation, which we're not able to have now, Paul. But I think we should meet again and continue this, because this issue will continue.
Just very briefly on this one, on two things, right? Firstly, real-time data. We've been calling this for 20 years. Some of us have been actively campaigning for this for 15 years, and until the pandemic came and lockdown, we were always told we didn't need it because the data came through the system, was analysed, it came out 9 months after the end of the previous year for the reporting, etc. So we didn't need this data. Suddenly lockdown came along and we needed this data, and the powers that be suddenly started making this happen. Now we've got it. It's a system that's now in place, and local areas can look at their local data, and it's suspected suicide. So it's before it goes through the inquest system, which can be dreadful and can take 2 years in several cases. So yeah, it's real-time suspected surveillance. The reporting now is, in Scotland, for instance, is probable suicides. So we're starting to get real about needing data upfront quickly. And also, we're starting to get real about things like within the hospital system. I saw a presentation 10 years ago by Dr. Matthew Large in Sydney, who said our risk assessment systems are killing people, which got everybody in the audience woken up. And he said, when people come into the hospital, they're categorized as high risk, medium risk, or low risk. And we're finding out that the people categorized as low risk are more likely to die by suicide because they don't get the support. If we categorize them as high risk to get support, they're less likely to die. So our systems are killing people, right?
Paul, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate your insight. I know we obviously started talking about statistics, but actually what's clear from that conversation is that they're not, 6,069 people are people, are people with lives of all different ages, different genders, and so on and so forth. So important to continue this conversation. The great work you're doing. I mentioned the Zero Suicide Society transformation program and your work on towards zero suicide as well. We'll put links to that in the podcast notes so people can find out some more information, Paul. I know you're very vocal on places like LinkedIn as well, so we'll get a link to your profile on the podcast notes as well. Thank you so much for joining us on Mental Health Monday.
Thanks, Mick.
I hope you've enjoyed this week's podcast. Thanks for checking out Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. You can find me on Twitter at Mr. Mick Coyle. You can also find me, Mick Coyle, on Facebook as well. Don't forget, if you want to speak to somebody about your mental health, you can do so. The Samaritans, free to call on 116 123. You can find mental health services where you are. Just look for the Hub of Hope. Type in your postcode. It'll find those mental health services close to you. And for support in a crisis, you can text SHOUT to 85258. That's if you're experiencing a personal crisis, you're unable to cope and need support. Shout to 85258. That's a text line. Do get involved in those services. In an absolute emergency, always remember the number to call is 999. Thanks for downloading the podcast this week. We'll be back next week with more Mental Health Monday.